May 8, 1941. The North Atlantic, somewhere between Greenland and Iceland. The ocean here doesn't look like water. It looks like broken steel. Waves the size of office buildings collide with each other, sending spray that freezes mid-air before it hits the deck. The wind doesn't blow, it screams. And somewhere in this chaos, a man named Captain Joe Baker Creswell is hunting something that shouldn't exist. He commands HMS Bulldog, a British minesweeper converted into an anti-submarine escort vessel. By every measure, the Bulldog shouldn't be out here. It's too small, too slow, too fragile for the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic in wartime. But Baker Creswell isn't worried about the Bulldog. He's worried about the U-110. The German submarine had been spotted 12 hours earlier, a U-boat, the most feared weapon in the Atlantic. Since 1939, German submarines had sent over 3 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the ocean. Ships carrying food, weapons, fuel, and soldiers, all torn open by German torpedoes and sunk into the black water, taking their crews with them. The British called this the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans called it something else, the slaughter. U-110 was no ordinary submarine. It was a Type WWII U-boat, the most advanced submarine Germany had ever built. Its captain was Kapitänleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness. Lemp had already sunk 17 ships. He was a killer, and he was good at it. And right now, he was running. Baker Creswell's radar operators had been tracking U-110 all morning. The submarine had surfaced briefly, a fatal mistake in daylight, and now the Bulldog's crew knew exactly where it was. What they didn't know was that they were about to capture something that would change the entire course of the war, something that would shift the balance of power between Britain and Germany forever. The Bulldog's engines churned, the depth charges were loaded and ready, but Baker Creswell wanted something more than a kill. He wanted a capture. He wanted the submarine intact. Why? He wasn't entirely sure. It was intuition, a hunch, a captain's instinct that told him this moment was different. What happens next will prove him right in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined. The depth charges fell like rain. 10 of them, 20, 30, hurled from the Bulldog's deck and from 2 other British escort ships, HMS Sharpshooter and HMS Shira. The charges descended into the darkness below. When they detonated, the entire ocean convulsed. Water erupted upward in massive geysers. The concussions were so violent that fish died from the pressure alone, floating to the surface with their air bladders ruptured. Below, inside U-110, the men were screaming. The submarine was designed for speed and stealth, not to withstand a concentrated barrage at close range. The walls of the pressure hull shook, equipment tore loose from its moorings, water poured through hairline fractures. Kapitänleutnant Lemp knew what he was experiencing. He was being hunted to death. U-110 had one option: surface and fight. At 10:39 in the morning, the submarine burst through the surface of the Atlantic, its conning tower breaking the waves like a whale breaching. Lemp scrambled topside, ordering his crew to man the deck gun. The Bulldog was right there, less than 500 yards away. If U-110 could get off a few rounds, maybe they could hold the escort ship below the waterline. Maybe they could buy time. Maybe they could escape. But something went wrong. The deck gun jammed. It wouldn't fire. Lemp screamed orders. His men tried desperately to clear the malfunction, their fingers fumbling with freezing metal, knowing that each second of delay was a second closer to death. The British were already moving. Baker Creswell was charging the U-boat, closing the distance, his guns blazing. The situation was catastrophic. Lemp had seconds to decide: go down with the submarine and take its secrets with him, or abandon ship and save his men. He chose his men. At 10:45, Lemp gave the order that would change history. Abandon ship! The crew scrambled up the ladder and into the freezing Atlantic. They knew they would likely die in the water, but they had a chance. Down in the submarine, they had none. What Lemp didn't realize, what he couldn't have realized, was that in his desperate scramble to evacuate, he had made a fatal oversight. In the radio room, in the captain's quarters, scattered throughout the vessel, were objects so secret that their loss would be considered a catastrophe in Berlin. Objects so encrypted, so carefully guarded, that their capture would be kept hidden from the world for decades. Lemp thought he was saving his men. He was actually delivering the key to the kingdom. The water was 17 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia would set in within minutes. Baker Creswell watched the German sailors thrashing in the ocean, their screams cutting through the wind. Part of him wanted to let them drown. They had killed thousands. They had sent women and children to the bottom of the Atlantic. They deserved to die. But he saw something else in that moment, an opportunity. He ordered a handful of men into the water to rescue the survivors, not out of mercy, out of necessity. A living prisoner could answer questions. A living prisoner could tell them what was inside that submarine. And Baker Creswell, still operating on pure intuition, still following that captain's hunch, knew that whatever was inside U-110 was worth saving. One of his officers, Sub-Lieutenant David Baum, was a young man with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. Baum was 23 years old. He had enlisted in the Royal Navy as a midshipman and had clawed his way up through talent and determination. He was exactly the kind of officer you wanted in a moment like this, intelligent, cool under pressure, and blessed with the rarest quality in wartime, the ability to recognize when something extraordinary was happening. As the Bulldog pulled alongside the sinking U-110, Baum led a boarding party across a rope to the submarine's conning tower. The deck was still slick with seawater. The submarine was listing, already half submerged. They had minutes, maybe less. Baum and his men dropped down into the belly of the dying submarine. The air inside was thick with diesel fumes and fear. Equipment was torn open, papers were scattered everywhere. German sailors had started to scuttle the vessel, trying to destroy anything valuable before abandoning ship, but they hadn't had time. There was too much. The submarine was already going down. Baum moved through the darkness with a flashlight, his heart pounding. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He was just grabbing whatever looked important: documents, code books, instruments, anything that might give the British an advantage. And then he saw it. In the captain's quarters, on a shelf, sat a machine. It was metallic, intricate, covered with rotors and wiring and plug boards. It looked like something between a typewriter and a telephone switchboard. Baum had no idea what it was, but something told him it was important. He grabbed it. He grabbed the code books, too, heavy leather-bound volumes filled with numbers and settings and dates. He shoved everything into a bag and climbed back toward daylight. The submarine was sinking faster now. The water was pouring in through the torpedo tubes. In another 30 seconds, it would be on the bottom of the Atlantic. Baum scrambled up the ladder and onto the conning tower. His men were already pulling him toward the rope. He jumped, landed hard on the Bulldog's deck, and turned back just in time to watch U-110 slip beneath the waves. The machine was safe. The codebooks were safe. But Baum didn't yet understand what he was holding. Neither did Baker Creswell. Neither did anyone on the Bulldog. They had captured something that would take years, decades even, for the world to fully understand. In that moment, they were simply sailors who had been in the right place at the right time. They had followed an instinct, and that instinct had just turned the tide of the entire war. None of them knew it yet. But in a few weeks, in a quiet English estate called Bletchley Park, men far more brilliant than any of them would begin to understand what had just happened, and when they did, the impossible would become inevitable. Bletchley Park didn't look like the most important military installation in Britain. It looked like a Victorian country estate that had fallen into genteel disrepair. The main mansion was a sprawling Gothic revival mansion surrounded by manicured gardens. Peacocks wandered the grounds. It seemed like the kind of place where wealthy families played lawn tennis and drank tea. But behind those walls, in dozens of hastily constructed wooden huts, something unprecedented was happening. The brightest mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts in the world had been assembled in secret to solve an impossible problem: how to break the Enigma code. The Enigma machine was considered unbreakable. It had been used by the German military since the 1920s, and every military strategist in the world believed it was mathematically impenetrable. Every message encrypted with Enigma was transformed into billions of possible permutations. To crack a single day's code, you would need to test billions of combinations. It should have been impossible. But the British were trying anyway. Alan Turing was the heart of this effort. Turing was 32 years old, socially awkward, and possibly the most brilliant logician who had ever lived. His contributions to mathematical theory had already established him as one of the greatest minds of his generation. But what made Turing truly exceptional was his ability to think in ways that no human had thought before. He could see patterns where others saw nothing but chaos. He could imagine machines that didn't yet exist to solve problems that hadn't yet been defined. Turing and his team had built something called the bomb, a mechanical machine that could test Enigma combinations at machine speed. It wasn't fast enough, not nearly. They were always one step behind. Every day, the Germans generated a new set of Enigma settings. By the time the bomb had cracked yesterday's code, today's code had already been encrypted. Thousands of messages were flowing in unread. Secrets were passing through their fingers. And then Sub-Lieutenant Baum's bag arrived at Bletchley Park. When Turing and his colleagues realized what they had received, an actual Enigma machine, intact, plus the code books with the actual daily settings, something changed in the room. There was silence first, then disbelief, then a kind of quiet euphoria that Turing later described as knowing you had just been handed the keys to a locked room that contained all the answers. With the physical machine and the codebooks, Turing's team could do something that was mathematically impossible before. They could see how the Enigma worked from the inside. They could understand not just the mechanism, but the logic behind the mechanism. They could predict the daily settings instead of having to brute force them. They could read German messages in real time. Within weeks, Turing refined the bomb. Within months, they were decrypting hundreds of German naval messages daily, and with those messages came intelligence that changed everything. The British could now read the orders of Admiral Karl Donitz before the U-boats received them. They could read the coordinates of German supply convoys. They could read the deployment orders of German fighter squadrons. They could read the movements of German naval task forces. They could read the strategic thinking of Hitler's high command. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had looked like a British defeat, suddenly became winnable. Convoys that should have been sunk were routed around German wolf packs. U-boats that should have found their targets found empty ocean instead. Between May 1941 and May 1945, the Enigma decryption saved an estimated 1 million lives. Some historians argue the number was even higher. One U-boat captain named Lemp, the same man who had abandoned U-110 in such desperate haste, survived the sinking and spent the rest of the war in a British prisoner of war camp. Before he died, a fellow prisoner asked him if he had any regrets about ordering the evacuation. Lemp said no. He had saved his men. That was the right decision. He was never told what happened on U-110 after he left. He was never told that the machine he had failed to destroy became the instrument of Germany's defeat. He was never told that his final command, the command to save his men's lives, instead cost the lives of millions of others. The Enigma machine that washed up on the deck of HMS Bulldog was supposed to be a curiosity. Instead, it became the single most important intelligence asset of the entire war. It would be kept secret for decades. The public would never know about it. The German government would never know about it. Only a handful of people at Bletchley Park would ever understand the true magnitude of what had been accomplished. But in the dark waters of the North Atlantic, on a single morning in May 1941, a captain followed his instinct. A young officer grabbed a machine he didn't recognize, and the course of human history shifted. All because something didn't go according to plan. All because a U-boat surfaced at the wrong moment. All because a deck gun jammed. All because a man chose to save his crew instead of destroy his ship. Sometimes history turns on the smallest decisions. Sometimes the greatest victories are won not through strategy or firepower, but through accidents and intuition and the strange grace of being in the right place at exactly the right moment. The men on HMS Bulldog never knew what they had captured, but they had captured something far more valuable than a submarine. They had captured the instrument that would transform defeat into victory. They had captured the machine that would make the impossible inevitable. And that machine would change everything.